Do you like freedom? And will you join us? Do you want to find the lost city of Atlantis? Well, hang in there, bud. Because together we're gonna find it here at TekWars 2.0. Well, here at TekWars 2.0. The lost ancient cities of your ancestors' past will be brought to the horizon of our surface-level panopticon. Boof and Warren won't do you wrong. You can break the cuffs just like I did here at TekWars 2.0. Here at TekWars 2.0. Here at TekWars 2.0. TekWars 2.0.
Hello everyone, this is Warren. I'm here with my co-host John. We're back with another episode of TekWars 2.0. We have Kenny Rowe here with us from Urbit. He's an extremely interesting, smart figure in the sphere that we live in on the net, and I'm very glad to have him on this podcast. So thank you, Kenny, for coming on here and taking the time to talk with us. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. The sun is out and couldn't ask for more.
Oh, that's nice. I'm in the city right now. I just came back from Woodstock and it was beautiful up there, perfect weather. And right now the city, it's just all rain and looks like a Blade Runner scene. It's kind of depressing, a little cool though, but not the greatest. So I wish I was where you were. Grass is always greener perhaps though.
Mm-hmm.
So Kenny, I wanted to ask you off the bat, we have a list of topics we're going to get into discussing, and a lot of it is stuff I had listened to a lot on YouTube with Isaac Arthur. He's the sci-fi futurist guy. Have you ever listened to him?
No, I don't think so, but tell me more.
He's just he's a futurist. He talks about the Fermi. He explains a lot of things like the Dyson spheres, Matryoshka brains, Boltzmann brains, warp speed, FTL travel. He has a whole ton of series on all kinds of interesting stuff. So I was wondering if you had listened to him, because a lot of these topics seemed very up his and your alley, and I would strongly suggest getting into Isaac Arthur on YouTube. That's a good plug, because he's a very, very interesting, smart guy who explains these topics very well, better than I could. But I'm excited to getting into talking about some of them. John, are you familiar with Isaac Arthur?
I'm not.
You're not familiar with Isaac either? I feel like we've talked about Isaac Arthur.
You've talked about him before, but I've never looked into him. I don't know.
You guys have to check out Isaac Arthur. He's great.
Okay. Will do.
But we have I wanted to talk about cryopreservation, because that's something you told me you wanted to talk about. And cryopreservation, I had just, when you sent me that you wanted to talk about cryo, I had just been reading Hal Finney's Wikipedia page, and Hal Finney is a cypherpunk who many people believe could possibly have been part of, or Satoshi Nakamoto, or part of the team that was Satoshi, or not at all. But he died, I believe, of ALS, and he had his body preserved in a what are they called? An Alcor nitrogen preservation tank. And it's extremely interesting what Alcor Life Extension does for people. He's their 128th patient. They have about 1,700 members. I don't know if that's people that are preserved there, but Alcor is the only cryonic company I'm familiar with. So Kenny, what do you know about cryo, and maybe you can cryo pill me a little bit on on this kind of life
Yeah.
extension stuff.
So the cryo pill is actually it goes back to the 70s, and people started becoming or doing this as far back as I think it's like the late 70s, early 80s. And back then, it was really the idea was if you froze your body, put it in such a state that it wasn't there was no damage coming through, there was no loss of information, nothing was happening. It was like sort of this perfect time capsule. Then at some point in the future, when we figured out how to cure whatever killed you, like cancer or heart attack or whatever, then they could thaw you out and then bring you back in your normal body, right? And you would just sort of like wake up. And you see this happen. You can see like this sort of idea play out in a lot of different like feature films, right? So you'd sort of go to sleep or accidentally being frozen or something like that. You wake up 50 years later and your heart starts and you just go off and you do you do your thing again.
Yeah, the one thing I'm really familiar of is whenever I think of cryo, perhaps I shouldn't, but I always think of Austin Powers when he loses his mojo and they cryo freeze him to bring him forward into time, and then they unfreeze him, and there's that whole scene where he's naked in the cryo tank. I always think of going back into my childhood and being way too young to be watching Austin Powers, but that Austin Powers scene always comes to mind.
And then he has to like urinate for 14 minutes.
Yes, exactly. That's what
So, I mean, and there's some reason to believe that this idea is, or at least there's the kernel of truth here, right? Because we also know that people who like fall into ice, for example, they can be underwater for 30, 40, sometimes a few hours, and they can still be brought back. So they're dead. I mean, they're really dead. There's nothing going on, and they can still be brought back. And people have done experiments with like dogs and things. I remember seeing this one experimenter who'd like literally killed his dog like 10 times, like his own dog, by freezing it down, till his heart stopped and then bringing it back. So there's at least some, I know, right? It's
some Rene Descartes stuff right there.
Yeah. So it is certainly, there's some possibility that cold or at least freezing, or at least some sense like that can be a sort of a suspended animation. That's not actually what I'm all that interested in, honestly, because I think that's somewhat short-sighted in the longer scheme of things. Because say, okay, you did come back 50, at some point in the future, and they fixed whatever's wrong with you. Something else is going to break, and you're either going to have to do this whole process over again, or it's never really going to be perfect, or really what I'm interested in when I think about cryopreservation. And so when I'm thinking about cryo, is I'm thinking about preserving information, not a body necessarily. Even though there is information in the body, that's not really what I care about. And I also don't really view it as life extension or living forever. Okay, and I'll get to why I think that. So if you freeze the body very, very quickly, there's a good chance that a lot of the information that's contained in who you are and what your memories are is preserved. And then it just becomes a matter of, okay, if that information is still there, can it be translated into either some digital form and then reconstituted in some other way? That make sense?
Yeah, that brings me to thinking about information theoretic death, which I'm looking at now on Wikipedia. So what kinds of information could be, I guess I would want to ask, be stored on a cryonic system? If not bodies, then what kind of information would benefit from cryonic use?
Well, you think of the body as being the vessel of information,
right?
And after you die, the process of the molecules losing coherence and drifting apart destroys that information of that being, of that person, potentially, right? I'm not completely sold on the idea that all you are is a brain. That's not what I'm actually saying here, but I think it's probably a good part of that. It's not exactly materialistic, and it's not completely spiritual, meaning you're probably not like part of some gigantic global, well, maybe you are, some global consciousness, something like that. It's probably somewhere in the middle or some kind of combination. But likely, if you're able to capture enough of the right information, you could then put it into a different substrate. So in this case, what I'm envisioning is something more like an emulated brain. This is not artificial intelligence or uploading your intelligence into the computer itself, but you could think of it more as like sort of like the Bernoulli effect. Like airplanes don't flap their wings, right? But we do know why flapping wings makes a bird fly. Same thing with an airplane. The high pressure over the wing and the low pressure below, that's what actually creates lift. So in an emulated brain or an emulated human, one part of that emulation is going to be some model of what the brain is, what it's doing, how it does it, that sort of Bernoulli effect of a human, right? And then if you have the state, you could translate that into that model and then sort of wake up. But when you wake up, right, it's not necessarily in a body, though it potentially could be, depending on what the infrastructure looks like. It's probably going to be in a very large simulation. This is what an emulated world would be like. And this is already starting to pervade itself into our kind of pop culture, right? There's just, I think, a brand new TV show came out from HBO called Upload or something like that, and numerous other books. So this is very much an idea that sort of makes sense to people. But when you look at it, there's really three components that need to sort of all work together in order to make this happen. You need to be able to translate that data from some substrate into this model. So that's going to probably be some sort of scanning technology, right? And we've seen scanning technologies come down in price dramatically and an increase in resolution over the last number of years, from fMRIs into CAT scans, and you just name it, right? There's many, many different kinds. And right now, the highest resolution sort of scan that we have is destructive, meaning you take a very, very sharp knife and you slice through the frozen brain, and you just keep doing that and then scan the portions and then at the end, you have a 3D model of what that brain was. And that's currently like the state of the art right now when it comes to extracting the information out of a biological substrate. Okay, so that's one thing. So you could imagine, okay, well, what would we need in order to have high enough resolutions at low enough costs in order to get something like atomic scale resolution? Okay, well, you can forecast that out and that should be follow a curve roughly similar to Moore's law. So that's sort of well known. The second piece is then going to be, well, what is this thing going to live in, right? Well, this is a computer. It's going to live in some sort of computer. And again, we have the same kind of cost curves and performance that we see with scanning technology. So we can roughly have an idea about when, the computational power of something that we guess a human brain is in some sort of compact form that's relatively affordable. So between those two variables, we have something like within the next 10 to, let's say, 40 years that we're looking at to something like this is actually really feasible. And if you can get your body frozen at some point to the point where that seems feasible, the last piece, which is the hardest piece, is going to be the model. What is the brain and how does it work? Or can we come up, or do we know something enough about it such that we can make a computational infrastructure that roughly does the same thing? Maybe it's not exactly the same, it's not neurons or whatever, but it'll work, right? And then that one is less tricky. It's more tricky to really determine because models tend to be binary in the sense of all of a sudden you have them or you don't. I mean, you're working on them for long periods of time, but they usually just they're far harder to predict when they're going to be ready. But let's say 100 years seems roughly reasonable to assume that our knowledge of the brain and modeling and software would all advance to the point where we could do something like this within the next 100 years or so. And so I'm sitting here thinking to myself, being stuck in quarantine for the last however many months, updating my will, because what else are you going to do, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, this seems like something I've been thinking about for a long time. And honestly, the hardest part about it, was not deciding to do it for myself, but was like talking to my family about it. But it's becoming easier because these ideas are kind of becoming more mainstream. So at first, when I told my family about this, they were like, Kenny's a little out there anyway. This is actually not that weird for him, but if this is your will and this is what you want, okay, if you write up the will that way, then we'll do that. And it turns out you can take out life insurance policies to pay for all this stuff, right? So that's what I'm in the process of doing right now, is actually securing a life insurance policy that will go to somebody. And what will happen is, if all sort of goes to plan, most people, when they are getting close to the end of their life, it's not a surprise. You're in a hospital, you have some sort of terminal disease. It's not really something you didn't know was coming. So at the point at which you're in hospice care, you make the phone call, the team assembles, they bring all of their gear, and as soon as you're pronounced dead, they immediately start draining the fluids from your body, and then they put you in an ice bath, and they've got a whole procedure that they've been perfecting over the last 40 years doing this to people. And they get you all the way down, and then they dunk you in the liquid nitrogen, and then you wait. and then in my will, right, I'm going to I have specified that I don't want to be brought back unless there's about an 80% chance that this is going to work. Like, that's my, and I have a few other stipulations that I've put in there, but you can write out as many as you want, right? I don't want to be brought back unless I have, so much money in reserve or whatever your requirements are. So that's literally what I've done over the last 6 weeks on this topic, and also why it's a top of mind for me and why I wanted to talk about it. So that's kind of what, my journey with cryopreservation and what I'm planning to do with it.
That's really, really incredible. It reminds me of something that my girlfriend was actually just talking to me about when she's a brother and a sister. Her sister is the youngest of, like, the baby of the family. And when they were all children, it hit her that she could potentially be the only one living if everyone dies first, and kind of broke down crying and insisted that they chalked up this crayon contract, and it stipulated that all the members of the family would agree to be cryopreserved in the event of their death. And I just thought that was kind of a funny little connection, but it is something that is serious these days, and people are putting it in their wills, and there are experiments that have added credence to the idea of cryopreservation and the preservation of information into other brains, at least, if not your previous one, to be preserved. I think Walt Disney's is even one of the most famous preserved brains or something like that. I'm not positive, though.
Yeah.
And
there's some other things to remember, right? Like, even if all of that part goes to plan, like, meaning you redo all your research, you get all of the paperwork in place, right? And that's just where I'm starting this process. And you go all the way down, you get perfectly cryo frozen, but then in 20 years, oops, there was a power failure that they couldn't recover from. Or, not necessarily a power failure, but, your particular tank lost pressure. Or the company went out of business and nobody took the lease on all of the cryo tanks. There's so many things that can go wrong. So it is a long shot. It is by no means like a foregone conclusion that this will work. In fact, it's probably, if you take all of those and you just sort of multiply them out and give them percentages, which there's actually a couple spreadsheets online that'll actually help you do this, you kind of come up with something like between a 5 and a 10% chance that you would even make it all the way through to the end. But that's a non-zero chance, because there is a 0 chance nothing will happen if you do nothing. But that's the way I look at it. It's sort of like, it's a long shot, but if I don't take some action here, then I know exactly what will happen, which is to say nothing. And on another side too, there are some questions that you really do need to struggle with, like, there are issues of death that we all sort of like instinctually have to grapple with, like, I don't want to die, right? I don't really think this is an answer to death, because I don't think that whatever comes out on the other side is really going to be me. In the same way that my kid is not me, but it's kind of like me, right? Like, kids are kind of like little versions of their parents. They have a lot of the same genetics. maybe even have some of the same traits and same mannerisms, but they're their own thing, right? Even a twin sibling who looks exactly like you, has the same DNA. You're not the same person. From the moment of conception, almost there's a slightly different pattern to the way those organisms are evolving, and as they grow up, they become very, very much different things. That's what this will be, right? It won't be me. It will be something very much like me. It might even have my recollections or memories, but it won't be me. I will still die regardless. There's nothing I can do about that. I've already I haven't made peace with it, because you don't really make peace with it until it's staring you right in the face, right? But it's not me. I think of it more as a long shot, and it's something that I can push into the future. Very much like kids. Like kids are a legacy. I see this as a legacy, or giving my body over to an experiment, a scientific experiment, because maybe my body will be one of the bodies that doesn't work, but they learn something. And that's okay too. Like, that's all right. This is not for me to survive and live forever. I am going to die. But maybe something else like me might survive.
So something I saw in the list, you talk about Boltzmann brains, and I was wondering if this has anything to do with what you're talking about, and if so, what's the crossover there?
No, I mean, a Boltzmann brain is essentially like, if you imagine at the very lowest level of physics in quantum mechanics, probability is far more influential and describes more about what's going on than at our sort of macro level, where it's sort of cause and effect. So what that means is, because the macro level comes from the micro level, there's always this possibility, given enough space and enough time, that really, really weird things can happen. Like fully formed brains spontaneously generating themselves out of nothing in space. That's what a Boltzmann brain is. And that is such a weird idea that that's even possible, but it's just because there's so much time and so much space, and it's just a matter of probability, really. But then, like, what are the characteristics of one of these things? What if it showed up in our solar system, right? I think in the Guardians of the Galaxy, I think the sequel, the one of the characters, I think is his dad. That's a Boltzmann brain. Like, it just sort of manifests itself and then builds, the civilization around itself. And the reason I put it on the list is because one of the things I'm interested in general, besides, cryopreservation, is sort of like fundamental forces, physics, and the stars and things like that. And like, why don't we see evidence out there that there's, and because a Boltzmann brain, like, if it just sort of spontaneously generated itself anywhere, by us, we should be able to probably detect something like that. But we don't see them, and they're so minuscule. Like, it's just hard to imagine. We don't really grasp big numbers, and just the sheer possibility of one of these things exists at all is pretty low. In fact, they might not. They probably don't. But it's an interesting, just sort of thought experiment. So they're not really related, I guess you'd say, but they're certainly interesting.
So I guess we can go back to talking about the Boltzmann brains, because I want to know a little bit more. But first, I just wanted to ask about what you were saying before. So will the new Kenny be a Kenny 2.0 if it has the same thoughts and exact same brain interface down to its each specific neurons? Or is the reason it's not you because there's something of the substance of spirit which won't survive the ultimate death, or is it something else?
So spirit, I don't know. Right? I'm not a dualist, meaning I don't think that there is some sort of spirit inside your head somewhere. Now, that's not to say that it might not have some similar properties, meaning the brain does sort of display almost antenna-like properties. So it could be that your consciousness, or the thing that makes the qualia of your experience, that doesn't necessarily have to be because of the way the neurons are structured, so to speak. Like the consciousness might be a phenomena that is aggregate,
Yeah,
and right, and or emergent. lots of different things that it could be. I'm not really sold on one thing or another, but will it be Kenny 2.0? Well, I mean, in some ways, certainly, if it does have memories, it might not have my memories. It might just be conscious enough that it can interact with other, beings of its kind or the outside world. In which case, that's okay with me too. In a recent book Neil Stephenson wrote, where this idea was sort of explored, most of the time the people that go in, they don't really have much of a recollection of their past lives. So I think that's certainly possible. But it could also be going back to that thing that I was talking about like, what is the brain doing? Well, if the brain is sort of like an antenna, well, we can make antennas, right? We can maybe shape something that had the same pull to the galactic consciousness that my brain has, even though it's modeled in a computer, right? So that's all certainly possible. I don't think it gets reduced down to any one idea. I do think that I don't think the brain is a computer, or at least it doesn't act like the computers that we have. But I don't really know. But it doesn't necessarily matter for me to take steps in that direction as long as somebody figures it out. I'm guessing, I'll need the body. They'll need the body. I think they'll need that.
Yeah, I was wondering, you talked about making computational infrastructures of the brain, and Neuralink is a company who is mapping out each brain pattern down to specific neurons in each different node of the brain. And this made me think of the Matryoshka brain. I was wondering, have you read Accelerando by Charles Strauss?
No, but that sounds really great.
It is Accelerando. It's a great book. It discusses the use of Matryoshka brains, and it's a difficult word to pronounce, like a tongue twister. But it's the use of. Are you familiar with Matryoshka brains?
No, but I would really much. Please tell me.
Well, I'm not the best to explain it, but they're pretty much Dyson Sphere style computers that are used to generate with the immense power. There's also Jupiter brains, which harnesses the entire power of something the size of Jupiter instead of the sun. But a Dyson Sphere, I'm sure you're familiar with, is the apt one from Accelerando. And it's used, the Matryoshka brain is used to generate simulations of entire universes connected via wormholes. And they can also be powerful enough to scale other Matryoshka brains inside of themselves to simulate more than one universe. And this becomes fractal-like and creates multiverses. And I know that we wanted to talk about simulations a bit, so a bit of the matrix and the glitches in the matrix, its code, and the time on the event log of such a matrix. So I think this could be a good segue into that, perhaps.
Yeah, right. And another reference in pop culture is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is that's what the Earth is. The mice created it in order to output the answer to a question. And turns out the answer is 42. And if you don't ask the question right, well, then what do you expect? So that's usually the answer I give to anything that I want to be really cheeky, is just 42. That's it right there. So yeah, at that level of, let's say, computation, like it's like, okay, well, what could be possible? And then you also think about like this fractal nature of it, and then you sort of wonder about your own surroundings, right? Like, okay, well, if these things it seems quite straightforward. We do it all the time with our own, rudimentary computers. We simulate them and then run them inside themselves. So might you just, with enough time and energy and resources, just simulate everything all the way down, and then do it again, and then do it again? It's sort of weird fractal pattern. Yeah, probably. I think so. Yeah. It's hard to imagine that actually it's not something like that. But then that begs the question, well, if it is there something we can learn from the way we do it, such that we could either see it or prove it or some other way? And I think the answer is probably no, but it's nice to think about, or at least speculate about, how that might happen. And so Some of the ways that might happen, you'll see this often, actually in Westworld. They're exploring this idea in the third season, which is that if you give the simulation a lot to do, something that's computationally heavy, then you can see it sort of like the gears shifting or the gears moving a little bit, like that kind of idea. It's unclear to me like why you would be able to perceive that if you're inside, because wouldn't you also slow down? But that's one of these ways you might conceive of a way of overtaxing the system and seeing what sort of phenomena shake out as because the simulation is overtaxed. So it might be hard to see or to come up with a reason or something you wouldn't be looking for ahead of time, but it's possible that you might be able to use other techniques, sort of like randomness, right? So randomness is something we know to be sort of tricky to do, and if your actions can be sufficiently random enough, it potentially could shake loose some odd phenomena, and if you can record that phenomena enough, that can be sort of anecdotal. So, for example, I had some friends that would play this game. They would all be in the same city generally, and they would throw dice to get coordinates on a map. And they would just go to that place, and they would watch to see what would happen, that kind of thing. And they would do this often enough to try to come up with some statistical relevance to whatever their observations were. Now, the problem is that things like that, we know that if you go searching for something or if you're looking for something, you tend to see it, right? If it's on your brain, you might expect to see phenomena that's unusual,
Right?
And that can also be explained by just sort of like other principles that have nothing to do with simulation. So it's unclear to me whether we can sort of poke the simulation that we are likely in, but I think it's super interesting to be thinking about simulations that we can create, hence like the cryo idea. Where are all those emulations going to live? In what kind of framework? What is the way you'd want to make a simulation like that? What kind of computation? What are the resources? What would the sort of all these questions sort of buzz around in my head a lot? And I think, it's possible within the next 10 to 20 years, we might be starting getting close to answering some of those questions.
What do you think some of the answers, I don't know if you have any prophetic predictions about this, or this might seem like something you've thought about a lot, but what do you think some of the answers to that could possibly be, if you have any?
Well, I think I'm not really necessarily tied to any sort of model of computation, though I don't think it's going to be x86 or whatever, right? Whatever architecture that we're currently on right now. I think it'll probably be a bit more pure, at least in the simulation itself. I'm not necessarily saying it wouldn't run on x86 hardware, but I think what we are entering into since probably the late 90s, early aughts, in terms of a virtual machine sort of revolution, right? The initial virtual machines were just like, oh, I need another instance of Windows, and I can have two Windows, and they're just the same thing. And that was useful for sort of business cases, but it wasn't really that interesting, right? So when you push this idea further to any sort of abstract computation that you might want to think about, that's actually where things like Urbit come like onto the stage. So when Urbit was originally being developed, right, this is in the early 2000s, so the idea of what a computer is was starting to be questioned. It's no longer necessarily about silicon and memory chips and the constraints that come along with those. It's about the abstract ideal form of computation. And that's what NOC is. NOC is the definition of an idealized virtual machine that has no constraints over memory or network or any of these other things that physical machines have. So you can imagine other forms of computation coming about, or at least being theorized, that are maybe further along in their mathematical structures. Maybe they're based on something like the Rowe calculus, for instance, right? And if that's the case, whereas normal computers are based on lambda calculus, then all sorts of things sort of open up, because you can do infrastructure at a virtual level and at a physical level, and they're not necessarily the same, really. at all. And in a virtual space, right, all of the notions that you might conceive of as like time become something more like transactionally based, or like the speed of light in our world is the speed of causality. That's what that is. And in a sort of simulated sphere, we'll use Urbit again as an example. Knock being this pure function, you take events in on one end, and you get effects out on the other. And where those two things meet is sort of like in another dimension, right? They process based on the form, the math. That's how that's processed. But that happens on, like, let's call it the substrate. But when an event and a effect meet, or I shouldn't say where they meet. It's when you have an event, it's then transitioned. It becomes an effect. That is a moment of causality. That is the speed of light in a simulation, right? Which is kind of trippy to think that you can watch that happen. Or, I mean, we can't really watch it happen. It's still too fast. But you can at least conceive of what causality means in another dimension. Whereas it's in ours, it doesn't sort of really make sense.
I think if it's not going to be on Urbit, I think, one, we should have cryopreserved to Terry Davis, and two, it should have been on. I think the simulation should run on Temple OS, if not Urbit. But I
Sure.
cracked myself
as long
up
as it
with
works,
that.
right?
As long as it.
Yeah.
But no, but John, I think you've been asking me about Urbit a lot, and I've been talking to my co-host
Yeah.
John about Urbit for, I mean, John, how long?
Well, I mean, it's been definitely over a year by now, but I guess it's a good chance for me to ask. I just want to know, like, can you just dumb it down for me? What is Urbit? Like, what's the goal of Urbit, and just what is it? Like, I know about, like, stars and planets, but I don't know what they do. So
Yeah, John
Sure.
is I've been using Urbit for over a year now, and I talked to him about it so excitedly. He's very big into RuneScape and whatnot, but that's as far as his computational intelligence kind of goes. No offense, John.
well,
but
I've made set up master nodes on Odin.
oh, that's
So
true. You have set up master nodes before. That actually impressed me. But I think having an Urbit employee here actually would be kind of the best opportunity we have to finally clear pill John on the Urbit project, and the perfect person to kind of dumb it down for John would be you, Kenny. So perhaps we can get that.
Well, I'm not really interested in dumbing anything down.
True. True. Poor choice of words
So-
on my part, but
No, that's okay. But maybe just provide another
a good explanation for him.
some explanation of some of the ways that I like to
Yeah.
think about it. I've spent a lot of time trying to think about it, ways to explain this, because the thing that I actually do for the project is in the marketing and communications team.
Okay.
So, right. So it's sort of, but right now, mostly what I do is I work with communities, people that are actually trying to use Urbit, because Urbit is not easy to use. Kind of like we know it's not easy to use, right? But what is it? So another thing that I kind of thought about when I was thinking about preparing for the show is, like, Urbit is sort of like a second chance. It's like a do-over. It's a mulligan. It's what we wanted the internet to be in the 90s, and, well, it didn't actually turn out that way, plus some other interesting computer science. So what I was just describing there before about what Knock is, it's this definition of a virtual machine. That kind of came out of sort of that early work, and you get some basic benefits from virtualizing all this system, meaning the computer that you use, the network that you use, all of that stuff is virtual as opposed to physical. And the reason that's important is because there are some things that are what constraints are you choosing to work with? So in a normal computer, you've got a central processing unit, you've got the memory, two kinds of memory, the RAM, which is the random access memory, and you can think of that as like the size of your desktop. The bigger the size of your desktop, the more things you can put on it at the same time. But if it's really little, you can't. And then you've got the filing cabinet, which is like long-term storage, but it's really slow. It's cranked, like that kind of thing. In Urbit, there's no notion of these two types because it's all virtual. It's all, we don't care. Like the computer that's hosting Urbit has to deal with that. Yeah. So you have this sort of pureness of computation at sort of this higher level. And then you can use sort of like different substrates to make it work. And I don't know if you guys have ever played around with PCs much, but back in the day, I used to think that, I should be able to take my hard drive out of one machine and put it into another one, and it should just work. Like that made total sense to me. Like they both got, but it doesn't work, right? Like why doesn't that work? Well, the reason is because all of those things are integrated together and they have to boot together, right? In an Urbit, that's not the case. So you can take like the brain of your Urbit, this little file that's on your computer, and you can move it to a new computer and boot it up, and it just picks up right where you left off, like nothing ever happened. Like I would expect that to work. But the only reason it can do that is because it's different. It's removed from the actual hardware itself. And the interesting thing about why that's relevant is because we have on the internet, Linux machines dominated because they were free. So all of the servers are Linux machines. So Linux is now a commodity. You can spin up Linux machines, even virtual Linux machines, most of the time, very quickly, very inexpensively, with very little time and effort, right? So it's this commodity sort of substrate. And Urbit lives on top of that substrate. And the internet did the same thing with phone lines. There was this pervasive network already in existence, telephones. You'd send little beeps over those telephone lines, and then you could, send a message to your friend's computer across the world. Eventually, its own network and its own infrastructure emerged, and then it took off from there. And Urbit will do the same kind of thing. But because we knew how the internet and how centralized computing sort of ended up for us as we've moved over the last 5 to 10 years, we're trying to avoid some of those patterns. Now, that's not to say it's perfect. Of course, it's not perfect, and it would probably have its own issues that we run into. But the ideal version of any communication is from me to you. And there's no real reason that somebody else needs to be involved with that. And so in this case, we're doing this over Skype, right? We're having this conversation over Skype. Is there any reason there needs to be a company Skype? No. And the more things we can do like that, the more agency we will have is just normal human beings. And the value that is currently being extracted from us from all of these other platforms can be put to so much better use. So that's really the why of it. What it is, it's just a computer. But it has some interesting properties because it's a virtual computer.
Okay. So I guess I wanted to also ask, so what would be the benefit of owning like a star over a planet? Like what are the differences there?
Sure. So one of the problems that we had in the early days, maybe you guys have ever, spam, that kind of, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And spam came about because there was no way to sort of restrict or limit or put a cost on identity in the internet. You can just create a new one, right? On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. That was a classic meme before memes really spread around the world. Because it's true, like you can just spin up something new. Nobody knew who you were. You had this sort of flood of anonymity, and there was no check on that. So one way to put a check on that is to make identities or computers themselves a limited supply. You constrain the amount that there can be. So that's what an Urbit ID is. It's just like an IP address. Like there's a certain amount of those. And that reduces spam because there's a non-zero cost to acquiring one. Right now it's like $10, right? Which is actually maybe a little high. It could go all the way down to $1, and that would be just fine because, if you were to spin up lots of them, it would become expensive very quickly. And on the other side, people are assholes online. Like really, they're terrible people. Like they just lose themselves for whatever reason.
Yeah.
So we don't have any way
true.
to make people accountable. And if you have this sort of if you're an asshole on Urbit, nobody's going to talk to you anymore. So don't do it, right? Like it'll be or you're just going to have to hang out with other assholes, which is also fine. Go ahead, do that. And that's only possible from a persistent identity. It doesn't change, or it's expensive to make lots of them, that kind of thing. Okay, so what's the difference between stars and planets? Well, planets are an individual Urbit, like they're a computer, but they come from this thing called a star, and a star can create like 65,000 of these computers. And the reason that that runs in this way is because when you want to talk with somebody else, you need to find a path over the internet, over whatever network you're on, to send that information to.
Okay.
Right? And because I don't know where you are, so unless we have some sort like smoke, I don't know, how are we going to figure out where you are? Well, we need some intermediary to at least make connections for us, not host our content, or not that kind of service, but just to connect us. So what happens is when I boot my Urbit, I tell my computer tells its sponsor, which is in this case a star, what my IP address is. How can you find me on the network? Well, here I am, because your IP address changes all the time, and it keeps track, right? And then anytime you need to find me, you can tell your star, and those two stars connect, and they're like, okay, here's the path. There you go. And it connects us, and then it will send back the IP address so that we can make a direct connection between each other, and we don't need anybody else after that. And as long as our IP addresses don't change, we can still continue to talk. Or if we have some other way of sort of knowing where we're going to be, we can communicate without these sort of network nodes. But it's important that these nodes be sort of semi-professional for quality of service. So you might end up paying your star, $10 every 6 months or $10 a quarter or something like that for this service, and maybe if something else if you wanted to, because they are sort of like infrastructure nodes, which is the same as an internet service provider. Like they're roughly equivalent to some of the same things that we have today.
Yeah. So I guess that leads me into my next question. I was going to ask, so I'm assuming that the reason it's called like stars, planets, and galaxies is to sort of visualize the reason why you said it's limited, because there's a limited amount of stars, right?
Yeah. So the entire address space is, at least at the Urbit or the individual Urbit level, is 2 to the 32 bits. Right?
Yeah.
That's like 4.25 billion.
Okay.
And then the whole address space goes up to 128 bits. So we've got lots and lots of space to work with if 4.2 billion isn't enough. And by the way, we thought we were going to run into this problem with IP addresses. Turns out, IPv6 came along, very similar sort of situation. There are long-term plans if we need more address space, but right now that's because it's a nice clean 2 to the 32. That's 4.2 billion.
Okay. So what is the reason that it would need to be limited then? Is that for like you said, like if someone's an asshole, you don't have to associate with them. Is that the reason? So there's like you can't just like okay, all right.
So, yeah, but mostly it's for preventing something called a Sybil attack, preventing Sybil attacks, which is if you're an asshole and then you are like, Agent Smith, and you just reproduce, the whole world is just now assholes, which is where we live right now, by the way, right? So if it's expensive to duplicate yourself or to create new identities, then you won't do it, or at least you need a lot of money to do it.
Okay. Actually, so I had one more question. So, I'm not sure if this makes sense, but you mentioned why do we need the company Skype to be talking to one another? So, what's the difference if you replace Skype with Urbit? I'm not trying to like offend or like question you or press you super hard. I'm just curious of what makes it truly like peer to peer.
Right. So in that case, let's imagine there are applications on Urbit, which is very true. And by the way, Urbit is a project. It's not a company. There is no there's no company of Urbit. And I work for a company actually called Tlon, which is the primary developers, but there are other contributors, and so it's not just one outfit, though it's mostly Tlon right now. So the way Skype would work on Urbit is that data, which is separate from the interface or the presentation, some protocol would be defined, which in this case would be voice over IP or voice over Urbit, whatever that the protocol is, for condensing voice information and pushing it over to the wire. So that logic would be an application that you could literally install into your machine, just like Skype, right? But there's no Skype the company necessarily.
So you couldn't like get kicked off of how some people, I don't know how you could manage this, I guess, but you could technically get banned from Skype. There's oversight. There's a big brother aspect to Skype. Is this kind of as a information protocol, does this make it so that that can't happen, and that the Sybil attack preventions makes it so that you are just alienated instead of removed?
Well, yes, but also, how is it that you use Skype? You use it with a username and password.
Right.
Where is that username and password stored? It's not on your computer.
Oh, okay. I see where you're getting
It's on Skype's computers. And that's really what I mean by this.
Okay.
So the innovation here of an Urbit ID is you are that. You hold those keys. You hold your social connections. Yes, there might be a company that can, let's say, they're not happy with the fact that you're using their service, but they can't actually stop you from, one, because you can just change the code that has that part in it, or somebody else could, more likely, right? And there's always an authentication mechanism. That's really also really important when it comes to identity. It's if you've ever heard the term self-sovereign identity,
yeah,
Urbit is self-sovereign. That nobody has a list of passwords and usernames.
That actually just cleared up a lot for me too. So that was very, very helpful. Thank you for asking that, John.
Yeah.
I'm wondering. We have a lot of other stuff here. I am very interested in talking about, like warp and sublight speed drives or living as an EM. I am, however, wanting to ask about this quote you inserted first. It's, "I pack my things, the things I like, the things I need, with an aura of regret. I crawl into a comet and set my way to the stars, distant yet bright, sending out signals as I go. I'm here, I'm alive." And this is a beautiful quote. I Googled it and I couldn't find where it was from.
Yeah.
But I would want to know that. But what is the relation that has to anything? It reminded me of specifically comets and stars. Reminded me of Urbit, and sending out signals reminded me of Urbit as well. I'm not sure if that was the connection, but maybe Urbit's just planted into my brain so much that I'm associating so many different things with it. But I found that to be a beautiful quote, and I couldn't find the origin of it.
Yeah, it's gone. And so the only reason I have this is because I copied it when I saw it, because I loved it so much. This was a poem written, and it was called Breach. And it was describing the feeling that happens on the Urbit network when a particular event occurs. And so in this next story, I'm going to be sharing some like personal experience about Urbit. What does it feel like?
Yeah,
as opposed
absolutely.
to what it is or what is it good for, which I actually think might be more impactful than anything else that we can do about explaining it, right?
Absolutely.
So I've known about Urbit for a long time, like years and years, right? But I didn't actually start using it on a frequent basis until about a year ago. And it's really rough, like even more rough than it is now, right? But I quickly became attached to my name, which is the name that I chose. Well, it was given to me. Right. And at first it was like, this is kind of silly. It's got I can kind of say it, but I'm not even really sure if I'm saying it right. Like sick dev, pill nup. I mean, what does that even mean? And all of the names are kind of like that. But then I internalized it in this really weird way that ownership provides. Like, it's mine. Like, there's nobody that can take it from me. and I can control it and I can do with it what I want. Like the name Kenny Rowe that I use everywhere on all of these different social platforms, it's not actually my name, which feels even worse because it's actually my name. Like I use my name as a user, as a handle, and I have no control over that. Right? So I have these nonsense words that I have that feel more real to me than my own name. Like that was my first sort of like, this is interesting and really profound experience when it came to Urbit. And such that like I made my own t-shirt with my, name on it with the sigil, which is just like an algorithmically drawn logo of your name, which everybody has, right? And this poem, getting back to this poem, what it's describing here is something called breach. And there are two kinds of breaches. There's a personal breach, and then there's a network breach. And in a personal breach, it's sort of like what happens is, you get your Urbit into some state that you just can't recover from it. It's just completely borked. And you can just start over. It's like wipe the slate clean. Here's a new key that I'm going to broadcast into the network, and they're going to know, they're going to see this transaction happen, and then they're going to just pretend like, we're starting over from, well, they don't pretend. They start over from the very beginning. Everything you've ever done is erased, basically. And that's called breach, right? Now, because Urbit is still very much in development, it's not consistent, the network. Sometimes in order to bring in new features and make it the way work it's supposed to, the entire network has to breach. Everybody has to wipe the slate completely clean and start over again. And that becomes more and more painful the further it's been from the last breach. And we haven't had a breach in, I think, about 4 months, 5 months. And we've gone through a couple different iterations of the user interface. A lot more people have joined. A lot of the traffic is sort of solidified, so you really know the places you want to hang out on Urbit. And when this next breach happens, whenever it happens, that all just sort of gets wiped away, and you have to rebuild it all again. And it's a really hard. The first time it happened to me, I really wasn't prepared for what it was, because I sort of had built up a routine, and I kind of felt familiar. And then one day I get a message that says, "Hey, we're all going to breach." And the way I sort of describe this is, imagine you're all hanging out with some new friends in a big open field. And you've got campfires, and you've got your pup tents and your tents everywhere. It's pretty low level of infrastructure, but you're really like having fun because you're roasting marshmallows and you're telling stories. And then a bunch of people come over to the campfire, and they're like, "Okay, when you wake up in the morning, it's all going to be gone. The field will be completely empty, and here are the coordinates to the new campsite."
Oh my gosh.
Okay? And so you wake up in the morning, and there's nobody there. It's like, oh, I knew they told me this was going to happen, but now it actually happened. Okay, now I have to figure out how to get to this next spot. And then when you finally figure out where you are at, all of the infrastructure is upgraded. Now we're all living in yurts, and we've got some nicer lawn furniture. And it's more fun because, everything else is a little bit nicer. And then you get kind of into your groove, and then it happens again. And then eventually it won't ever happen. It'll just be continuous, and the network will never breach again. And we're probably within a year from that happening, but could easily be 2 more, 3 more breaches between now and then. And they're all going to have this sort of feel to them, because you actually have to download a new version of Urbit. You have to boot your ship in a particular way in order to join the network again. So that's what this poem was describing. And it hit me real because I've lived through it, and Warren, you will live through it too.
Yeah, no,
So,
I was just going to say, I just got hit in the feels hard just now. I feel like almost like upset. It's like a very, it evokes emotion, and yet it's from this computational system of numbers, of bits, and yet I feel like real emotion out of that. It's a really beautiful poem, and I have
yes.
I've had to breach my ship. I've told this story once before on the podcast, but when I first joined Urbit, I wasn't really familiar with the protocols of how you're supposed to behave on there and whatnot, and kind of autistically, I grabbed a Curtis Yarvin image and turned it into ASCII text, and I copied and pasted it into Urbit help for whatever reason. I don't know what was going through my head, but I did that, and it crashed my ship, and Palfun was just like, "Oh my God, what did you do?" And I had to breach it, and that's why it kind of hits me in the feels. It's like you wake up and all of a sudden everything that you've known and knew is gone, and you're in this kind of new campground, upgraded campground, but yet it's different yet familiar. And it reminds me as well of the Blade Runner Tears in Rain monologue. That's kind of what I was thinking about while reading over this poem was the "I've seen things you people wouldn't believe, attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion," that whole thing. And it's really beautiful. But it's something that I think it says a lot about the Urbit project, how these bits become your identity, how you talked about Kenny Rowe is your name, yet whatever, I forgot what your Urbit name was, but that's more your name than you feel Kenny Rowe is. And I feel like that's almost existentially I don't know, moving in a huge way. It really says a lot about the project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. And it's meant to be durable in that when this thing actually does get to the point where it's meant to be, we'll be able to look back and dig up old Urbits and inspect them the same way that we, look at old campfires from Native Americans that are lived 500 years ago or something like that.
Like that's Urbit archaeology.
Totally.
Oh my gosh. That's extremely interesting to me. Maybe I'll find my ASCII art from 2 years ago or something then.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
That would be really, really incredible. So it's as you put it, it's simple, it's durable, and it's yours. You own your data, you own your identity. It's purely yours. This is a huge innovation in computational science. I feel like it's, at least for me, it seems that way. And I urge everyone that's listening to this to go on to planet.market or urbit.live and get yourself an Urbit ID, or maybe ask me and I can try and set you up with one. But I think the most fun of it I had was troubleshooting getting my Urbit set up. It's just fun to tinker with. I think at least for me it was. So I do urge people to hop onto Urbit. I wanted to ask about the general relativity and transactional time that you mentioned as something that you've been thinking about. What would you like to say about these things? So what exactly is transactional time in conjunction with the general relativity?
So some of the things that we're noticing about the way networks work and the way messages propagate over a network and the way they churn from one type into another type, some odd things start to, or at least they start to very much resemble quantum physics or classical Newtonian mechanics, all these kinds of things, right? So what I'm getting at is that you can see some of these constraints in light speed and transactions of a simulation versus the time it takes for a packet to reach from Los Angeles to New York, and the probability that it's going to be lost or spontaneously generate, meaning like noise in the system, something like that. You get these sort of hearkenings back to the same sorts of physical laws that we have in the natural universe. And it just gets me that like the symmetry here seems more than just coincidence, that perhaps computation and it and bit are really one and the same, and that, yeah, it's all a simulation, but it's not a simulation like a giant computer necessarily. It's like that's what reality is computation. Stephen Wolfram, this is like the point of the computational universe, and he recently unveiled like a lot more of his thoughts on this idea, like these simple automaton that can create these amazingly complex behaviors. and it feels right. It feels real to me, and it feels deep in a sense that I really appreciate. And I'm just so glad that I get an opportunity to work at sort of like the nice edge of some of this stuff with what we're doing at Urbit. And yeah, so that's how those thoughts kind of come together.
Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry, is what that made me think of. Are you familiar with that poem?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, I don't know. It came into my head. That's really interesting, though. I mean, a lot of this brings me back to listening to Isaac Arthur, who I don't know why I'm shilling him so hard, but I promise I'm not paid by Isaac Arthur. But it's a I promise a very informational thing, informative thing to listen to maybe go to sleep to at night or something. It's really talks a lot about what we're discussing, except for the Urbit parts, which perhaps hopefully he'll listen to this, or we can get him on one day and Urbit pill him. But we're just crossing over an hour here, so I don't want to use up too much of your time. But something I did want to talk about as well was the classes of civilizations and the Fermi paradox, or the you mentioned the Great Filter, which is one of the things that could be a reason to an answer to the Fermi paradox, which is, for those who don't know, it's the kind of the paradoxical question of why, if the universe is so big and expansive, why haven't we found aliens yet? And aliens and UFOs are something that I'm extremely interested in talking about and listening about. I listen to a lot of George Knapp, and Coast to Coast is one of my favorite radio shows. So I would love to talk about aliens, the Fermi paradox, warp and sublight speed drives, as well as the Kardashev scale. We're currently, for those who don't know, at like a 0.73 or 4, I think, position in the Kardashev scale, which is almost a type 1, which is harnessing the entire energy of your planet. But then it goes up to a type 2, which is harnessing the entire energy of your star, type 3 of your galaxy, etc. So what would you like to say about these concepts? What are you hiding things about the aliens, Kenny? Do you know?
Am I hiding things? No, you should never hide things.
Do you
about
know?
aliens.
Do you know where the aliens are, Kenny? I feel like I don't know.
They're out there, man.
They're out there.
Well, that's the whole question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Fermi paradox.
That's the Fermi paradox. They should be out there, exactly.
There's a lot of stuff out there, so where are they?
Yeah, no, this is
so getting to those sort of types of civilizations, and we're sort of knocking on the door of a type 1, actually. Well, depending on, I mean, it's a long way. It's still going to be a long way before we can harness all of the amount of energy that the sun hits the surface of the Earth. That's
Right.
A lot of it. But, it's at least conceivably in our imaginations possible. And that next level out is all the energy coming out of your star. And in that case, that would be something like those Dyson spheres. You could build a giant solar thing around it, and you could have these black stars, and maybe we should be able to see something like that. And then after that, you've got an entire galaxy worth of energy to harvest, and what would that even look like? But the size that, I mean, and maybe there's even scales larger than that. I mean, the universe galaxies are quite plentiful. There's lots and lots of them. What scale is, or what organization? There could be organizations larger than that as well. And in which case, how would you know that you're actually not inside the energy harvester as opposed to anywhere else, I guess?
Right, or inside of the Matryoshka brain simulation of the universe, or of the universe inside of that Matryoshka brain's universe, or the one that universe created a Matryoshka brain to make one inside of the previous Matryoshka brain to simulate a new universe. It gets very fractal.
All the way down.
All the way down, yeah.
And so it seems like we at least have some places we could look. We haven't really found anything yet, but things that I'm very excited about are things like the project to put a large radio telescope on one of the dark side craters of the moon, something like that. Would be fantastic to see.
Oh, I
Um,
haven't heard about that.
yeah, yeah. It's more or less at the conceptual phase right now, but you could theoretically within the next 10 years or so see something like that happening if the requirements of the actual dish itself aren't that big, meaning if it's something you can just sort of unroll and the creator does most of the structural parts for you, something like that.
Right.
But the kind of data that we might be able to get from that, it might be orders of magnitude or several orders of magnitude better than whatever we had before. But I think we've got some new space telescopes coming on pretty soon that should also do some of this kind of stuff. The planetary sweeps that we've been doing where we keep finding these things on a regular cadence now. It's like, yeah, we've got, I think maybe like 10 or 15 potential Earth-type planets that we know about and where they are, that kind of thing. And then just everything that Blue Origin and SpaceX are doing is also really fascinating, even though it's really very conventional rockets and that such. But, I imagine within my lifetime doing something very similar to what my parents did, which was sitting down in front of the television and watching something that, nobody in their previous generation really could imagine happening, which is landing foot on another planet with humans. And that's spectacular. That would be amazing. I would love to see that happen. In fact, I have a what is it, a hot take on the current space race that nobody really talks about, because
hell yeah.
all of the attention is landing on Mr. Musk and what he's doing. And in some ways, yeah, you get that because he's so flashy and he's got such good style, right? But this is classic Soviet, like American space race, where the Soviets were ahead for nearly the entire time, and the Americans, turned it up at the last minute and landed on the moon first. Well, that's what I think is going to happen. I think Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin are going to land on Mars first. Just putting that out there right now.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. I think they are well ahead of where people think they are. I think they have got a really great team, and nobody's paying attention to them.
Yeah, I was just going to say I haven't looked much into Blue Origin.
Exactly.
I know about it, of course, but I never, it's always SpaceX that you hear about, never Blue Origin.
You always hear about them, but they're not that far behind in terms of actual, like what they can do and what they can achieve. So it's odd to me that they don't get as much press as they do. But on the other side too, like if you can imagine living on Mars, I mean, Elon can create really cool like stuff, meaning like rocket ships and solar energy and some of these other things, right? But if you're going to live someplace, I want somebody who's really good at operations. And I want the guy who can get me a stick of bubble gum to my house in 3 hours.
Yeah.
That's the guy that I want to build a space colony, right? Maybe I want both of them because they need to have at least some level of competition to make it a decent place to live.
Right.
Who knows? But my hot take is that it's Jeff Jeff's going to pull that out in the end. That's my hot take.
Jeff might just himself be an alien. I don't know. He's such a crazy figure. He has so much with the amount of money. I mean, people talk about Elon Musk being a billionaire, but Jeff Bezos with the Amazon Corporation being worth like $1.2 trillion, that's an unbelievable amount of money. And to have a space company that is possibly the silent killer, maybe they're purposefully keeping themselves kind of in the dark. Maybe they know something that the rest of us don't know. Maybe that's Jeff who's hiding where the aliens are, or he's joined them and he's colluding. Who knows?
Secret bunker.
Yeah, down in Antarctica or something. But
or underneath Lake Union. So because I live in Seattle, and so Amazon tends to dominate a lot of the.
Oh,
space.
okay.
Yeah.
So that's incredibly something I love to talk about, and we've discussed Neuralink and the information freezing and then uploading into a different kind of generative process machine. And I think my favorite answer to the Fermi paradox, or the one that I find to be the most practical, I'll ask what yours is after, but mine is that if these aliens are getting so advanced to a certain civilization type that they are not curious about seeking out other I don't know why they wouldn't be, but they're not curious of seeking out other planets and other life, and perhaps are so focused on preserving their own life that they do some kind of Neuralink Urbit style crossover of mind uploading onto a cloud computer and living in some kind of virtual reality forever. And so they don't inhabit the physical reality anymore. The question with that is then you would need a maybe Dyson sphere or something very large that would be present in the view of telescopes to generate the energy to run that. So it's a curious, that's I guess why it's a paradox of where are these things then? But I like the mind uploading answer to the Fermi paradox as to why we don't see these other creatures. I want to ask, what is your assumptions as to the answers to the Fermi paradox?
I think it's perhaps something similar, but perhaps it looks something more like inner space as opposed to outer space. So, in one of those solutions to inner space is virtualizations, or becoming digital or atomized to some degree. But there could also be other ways in which you could explore subatomic structures. For example, by either becoming, so the smaller you get, the less energy you need in order to sort of move around, right? So the energy requirements for keeping yourself aware and conscious actually go down. So there could be a race in some to go down because of those energy requirements. Maybe like interstellar travel, class 2 civilizations are harnessing all the power of a star. It's just really not feasible or practical or even possible. It's also possible that decentralization is the answer to that in the sense of, yeah, you can populate the entire, it just takes a very, very, very long time, but maybe there's something about, the classic, quote, subspace communication that you hear about in Star Trek or something like that, where possibly information can be shared or information can travel at warp speeds if you can make these things happen, but not atoms or physicalness. So in that case, the civilization spread out and probably become smaller too in the individual size and communicate either through these very, very large networks or through means of communications that we just can't even comprehend right now. Something like that, which in that case, they could be all around us or in us for that matter, and we just would never know.
You got
I think
me.
It's probably.
Oh,
yeah.
What are you saying?
It's probably the answer is something that we can't really think of, or at least easily extrapolate right now.
I got so hopped up when you mentioned the race to go downwards, smaller, because I think it was you I was talking to about. God, I'm smiling and laughing right now. I'm trying to hold back laughter because I love it so much, and I've talked about it so much with the 3-body problem.
Oh, I love that book.
Oh my God! Thank God you've read it. So when my favorite part, and spoilers for those who haven't read it, is when they. It's such a funny concept to me that the and possibly real. I think that I consider and I talk about the 3-body problem as being not science fiction but science prediction or science reality.
Yeah. It feels like that, doesn't it?
It does. It feels like that Xiqing Lu knows something, and he's just using a creative form to kind of prepare you for something that's actually going on. But the Trisolarian race, they build these quantum computers, or these supercomputers, and then they fold them, and they're able to master other dimensions. So they fold them down into like an 8th dimension or something to build these supercomputers inside of subatomic particles or photons, I think. And
I think it's like a little bit heavier, like a proton or something.
Yeah, proton, right.
Yeah.
And the light particles or something like that. I can't remember, but since they can't get there fast enough to Earth, they want to heed the scientific progress of Earth, and scientists are killing themselves left and right and seeing things and they don't know what's going on. Is what's really happening is these photons or protons, I think in the book they're called sophons, are these supercomputers that are folded down into the world of the 8th dimension and are pretty much invisible completely invisible to the human eye. So it's a supercomputer inside of a subatomic particle that is traveling around Earth, monitoring everything that you're doing, everything that you're saying, and going inside of quantum experiments to impede any progress on quantum knowledge and any further for figuring out of quantum science. And I think that's the most genius and hilarious concept of the entire book. And when I was being put onto the 3-body problem, I was being told about two things. One from the Dark Forest, which was the main character asking for a waifu from the UN in order to continue his progress, and that it's necessary for him to get to work. I thought that was one of the best things. But my favorite was the idea of folding down a supercomputer into a proton and then sending off those particles to Earth to monitor and impede any scientific progress. And that, I mean, I just love that. I don't know if you have anything to say on that or think about that, but I just had to share it.
Yeah, well, something interesting with that, right, is that the technology that they use actually to send that proton to us, that's just a particle accelerator, right? Which we have giant particle accelerators, and that's literally what we're doing at CERN right now, smashing these things together to do fundamental research, of which those are the experiments that they were messing up, from space. So basically, you just open in that accelerator, point it at the sky, and then zip this thing around. And it gets near the speed of light because it's so small, right? So when we're talking about warp and sublight drives, probably the only thing that's practical to send to something near the speed of light is something like a proton or maybe something slightly heavier, like a small molecule, like a hydrogen molecule or something like that, right? So in fact, NASA just put out a paper where they've discovered this. There's this property of which, like, if you can imagine like a little stick of matter bouncing back and forth in a closed cavity, right? If it hits the backside, it'll cause the back of the container to move, but as soon as it hits the other side, it'll just move back and forth. So you never ever have any forward momentum, right? But if you make the bottom half of that pendulum swing at close to light speeds, then you actually will get forward momentum. You just don't. There's just no way to practically do that. And so they discovered that, oh, well, you could do that if you were making that thing spin, right? So now you get one end of this like mass that's spinning at close to the speed of light, and then that would give you forward velocity. Now, the big problem was the energy required to make something like that, and theoretically possible, right? But actually to make an object spin like that, or to actually accelerate to that kind of level, it would be more practical to take the energy, convert it into mass, and just throw it out the window. Like, that would be more energy efficient than actually doing one of these like light speed drives or sublight speed drives, which just gives you an idea about the kind of physics that we're talking about when it comes to like the speed of light. It's just crazy the amounts of energy required to even come close to something like that. And so warp drives or Cuvier drives are this idea that you could use that energy to actually grab space itself and bring it closer to you, which I think is also pretty cool, right? And we've been toying with this idea for a long time, but still the amounts of energy that would be required are vast amounts, something like in the order of a type of a, like the entire amount of energy contained in Jupiter or something like that, which is a lot. And but I actually had a colleague once, the last project that I worked on actually worked on warp speed drives, right?
Oh, no way.
Totally. And he just said he couldn't ever come to, like, the equations that were required to sort of make this work require negative energy. And he just really, like, if you had that, he's like, yeah, you can do this will work. But just can never ever come to some idea about what that is or could be. And so but that's the kind of work you end up doing occasionally, is when you like, hey, what did you do? Well, I worked at I was at a private contract to discover if Cuvier warp drives were meaningful, and equations seemed to work out all right, except for I couldn't figure out what negative energy is, and now here I am working on a blockchain.
Oh, what a thing to put on your resume. I was working on warp drive theories, but then I Oh man, it's such an exciting thing for me to think about. I'm so glad you brought it up because everyone thinks about the idea of expansion and going bigger and going into space, into the stars. But I guess your answer to the Fermi paradox is now my favorite of the going inwards and going smaller, as Shi-Ching Lu put it, is to maybe fold up dimensions and put yourselves inside of them in this kind of inverse geometry. It's such a mind-bending, incredible idea to me. I just love it so much. It's and I'm going to do something that you mentioned that you do, is giving out the 3-body problem as gifts. I think I'm going to buy like 10 copies of them and write some insightful notes inside of them and give them as birthday gifts and Christmas gifts and whatnot to friends and family, because it's definitely one of the best books I've ever read, and it gets me so excited to, whenever I meet a fellow person who's read it, to talk about it with.
Highly recommended.
Yeah, all of this has been extremely interesting, so I guess we can probably wrap it up here. I'm like smiling right now. I'm so excited we got to talk about all of this stuff. So thank you so much for coming on. And is there anything you'd like to plug?
Well, just Urbit, so that's easy to find. Urbit.org is where you can find more information. Also, if you like some of those other links, like OpenSea, you can get Urbit IDs, Urbit.live, of course, and Planet.market, all great places to go. Planet.market will host your ship for you, which is also very nice, or host your Urbit for you. But otherwise, if you have trouble getting your Urbit started, I am here to help. You can always DM me on Twitter at Kenny Rowe, or the primary resource is urbit.org/install. And that's how you can figure out how to get this thing started and figure out what all the fuss is about.
Perfect. And I think the correct end note would be to reiterate the Breach poem. So I'm going to say it and then we'll end the recording. Because I pack my things, the things I like, the things I need, with an aura of regret. I crawl into a comet and set my way to the stars, distant yet bright, sending out signals as I go. I'm here, I'm alive. And that's all for the show. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Kenny.
Thanks.